Today, we heard a reading about the birth of Samuel, or that is at least what the chapter in the Bible is titled. Who is Samuel that we should care about his birth? Samuel is the only person in the Old Testament who we hear his story from before his birth until after his death. He was both a judge and a prophet. He helped usher in the new monarchy and anointed its first two kings, Saul and David. Samuel was a shaper of nations, a maker of kings, a big guy in history. But in this chapter entitled The Birth of Samuel, do we hear anything about baby Samuel? About the pregnancy? About the birth itself? No. This story is about Hannah. There's a long-standing tradition in the Old Testament of God using women cast down by society. In a time when a woman's worth was determined by her ability to bear children, barrenness was a curse beyond all others. And yet, when we look at famous stories in the Bible, some of Israel's most famous leaders were born by seemingly barren women. In Genesis 21, the exceedingly old Sarah gives birth to Isaac, the child God promised to Abraham. In Genesis 25, Rebekah gives birth to Jacob and Esau after many years of barrenness. In Genesis 30, Rachel is finally able to bear a child to Jacob after much suffering and anger. In Judges 13, the seemingly barren wife of Manoah gives birth to Samson after receiving a message from an angel of the Lord. Hannah's story is a continuation of this auspicious line of women in the Bible whose children's exceptional birth points to divine concern and purpose for the child. Imagine you're a young woman and you're married to a kind man. In a time of arranged marriages, you find a man who actually loves you. Imagine the joy you feel at the thought of bearing his children. But many years pass and you're not able to have any children. This is bad enough because you are ridiculed by society. But to make matters worse, your husband has a second wife, and she has 2 children. She knows that despite your barrenness, your husband loves you more. And so she makes your life miserable. She makes fun of you and degrades you. You become so depressed that you can't even eat. When you tell your husband what's wrong, he says, "You don't need kids, you've got me." When you try to go to the temple to pray about it, the priest tries to kick you out because he thinks you're drunk. But in the midst of all that, you go before God and you lay your soul bare. You beg. You say, if only God will give you a son, you will dedicate him to God for the whole of his life. And then, wonder of wonders, it happens. After years of barrenness and ridicule and suffering, God grants your prayer. Then, so that no one can ever forget that Samuel was a gift from God, she names him He Who Is From God. As I was reading and thinking about this passage, I was reminded of a quote from one of my favorite fiction authors. In the prologue to the book Furies of Calderon by Jim Butcher, he writes, "The course of history is determined not by battles, by sieges, or by usurpations, but by the actions of the individual. The strongest city, the largest army, is at its base made up of a collection of individuals. Their decisions, their passions, their dreams, and their foolishness shape the years to come." If there's any lesson to be learned from history, it is that all too often the fate of armies, of cities, of entire realms rests upon the actions of one person. The greater narrative of the nation of Israel is interrupted to tell the story of this one woman. And as so often happens, when God gets involved, this seemingly unimportant woman makes a vow that changes a nation. In this story, it is Hannah's decisions, Hannah's passions, Hannah's foolishness, and Hannah's dreams that shapes a nation. She is in an impossible situation for a woman of her era. She is barren and co-wife with a horrible woman who lords her own fertility over Hannah. Hannah brings her despair before the Lord, makes a vow, and follows through with that vow no matter how difficult. In the verses immediately following the reading for today, Hannah takes her gift from God and gives it back to God. She returns to the temple and gives Samuel to Eli and dedicates the baby to God's service. I cannot imagine having prayed for years to have a child, finally having him, and then after 3 years, giving him up. While she may have thought she was only fulfilling a promise she made to God, she was doing so much more. How could the decisions that you and I make today, good or bad, right or wrong, change the world? It might seem inconsequential at the time, but who knows how God can use your obedience? We might say, just this once, or no one will know. No one would have known if Hannah had not kept her vow. She could have kept her vow to herself and kept her child. Instead, after only 3 years with her child, she does what seems to be the impossible. She gives her child back to God, and her child changes the course of a nation. Before the story of Samuel's birth, we end the narrative in the book of Judges with a horrific scene of rape and kidnap. The final verse of the book reads, "In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes." The era of the Judges was coming to an end due to widespread anarchy. This is when we shift to the story of Hannah. If you are reading it straight through, it might seem like a rather abrupt shift from a story of national importance to a story of seeming unimportance about a downcast woman who cannot conceive. But what would have happened if Hannah had decided to keep Samuel? Would anarchy and violence have continued? Would Israel have survived? However, it is hard to imagine that any decision we make in our everyday lives could ever change the world. How can one person in 6 billion who has no special political power, fame, or money make a difference? What gift do we have to give back to God? What can I, an accountant, a lawyer, a teacher, a business person, give back to God to change the world? In Romans 12, Paul writes, "Just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ, we who are many form one body. Each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given us." Every single one of you has a gift, a Samuel, from God. Perhaps you are particularly good in business, and you can conduct every business deal with integrity and witness to God by your honest actions. Perhaps you are a teacher who can treat every child with the respect they deserve as children of God, created in the image of God. It may not seem like these deceivingly small actions can change the world, but even helping one person, changing one situation, changes the world that we live in, if only for that person. We do not need to be daunted to change the whole world, but if we can do the right thing in our small corner of the world, God can surprise us with the results. Therefore, whatever you do, whatever you are, whatever gift you have, give it back to God. But then I know sometimes we look at our lives and say, what gifts are here? Well, we do not all suffer from infertility as Hannah did. We all have barrenness in our lives sometimes, times when it appears that we have nothing of value, nothing to give back to God. But there is hope. God does not ask us to give to him. God asks us to give back to him. God will provide us with what we are to give back to him. When we feel empty-handed and barren, what do? Do we sit down and give up, raising our hands saying, "Oh, well, I have nothing. I guess I don't need to give anything"? Or do we turn to God as Hannah did? Marcia Mount Stoop says that Hannah does not come to God with a formal petition. She does not come with a traditional sacrifice. She comes in isolation, loneliness, and despair. Hannah's faithfulness is embodied in how she is drawn to God in her brokenness. She is there as her whole self, cultural baggage, broken dreams, audacious hopes, and all. This is the person that God remembers. Hannah shows us that God can often have more in store for us than we could have ever imagined. Because of her faith, Samuel, he who is from God, was born. And because of her loyalty to God, he was dedicated to the service of the Lord and changed the course of history.